Hello, hello. I think we're live here.
Okay.
Let's double check here. If you can hear us, if you can see us, please leave us a comment. Let us know that we're looking good, sounding good. We're excited to be chatting here with you guys today. And while you're down there in the comments, definitely let us know if you are where you're at, where you're from, what builders you're using, different stuff like that. If you ever used BEM before, if you know what that is, if you're just coming here to learn, yeah. But while we're doing that, while you guys are getting those comments in there, my name is Mark Szymanski. I'm joined today by Alan Blair of WP Easy. Thank you, brother, for stopping by. I greatly appreciate it. How are you doing?
Good. Happy to.
Oh, yeah. High level here. I think, we talked about as far as Alan reached out to me. I wanted to give you guys the context of how this kind of came to be. And then we'll kind of talk about like the whole topic and everything like that. So Alan reached out to me. Alan makes fantastic videos. It's linked in the description. I think it's linked in the actual title of this video. If you click on WP Easy, you can go right over to his channel. Makes fantastic videos about bricks builder, BEM, all sorts of stuff. And he reached out to me the other day because, again, as fellow YouTubers, we're always open to collaborating and everything. And we wanted to have a conversation about BEM. So I admittedly am newer to bricks, probably in the last like 6 months. Or so. I just started kind of getting into bricks. I was Elementor guy, so like class-based and all that sort of stuff is very new to me. I'm still learning a lot of it, and I'm excited to have people like Alan on the show and just on the channel and everything like that to have a different perspective and just educate me as well as you guys. So that's kind of the overview of what we want to do here today is just have a chat. You guys can ask some questions. Alan's going to demo some stuff. We'll have a good back and forth. It'll be a good time. We're just hanging out, talking about WordPress and stuff like that. So, Alan, I'm going to kick it over to you, man. Tell the people who you are, what you got going on, how you got into this arena, and why you love BEM so much.
Sure. Hey, I'm under pressure now. We got Maxime the magician in here, so he's probably going to comment and tell me where I've got it all right and wrong. Hey, Maxime, how are you, buddy? Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah, so look, I guess I, like you, I was a Elementor user prior to this, and this whole switch to bricks of what we call a class-based system was a little confusing at first. Like to me, all HTML is class-based for your styling and getting your head around what does that actually mean. And once I realized that in bricks, when they're saying class-based, it means all of your UI settings can be applied to a class, which makes it highly reusable and easy to manage. Then you have that challenge of, well, what do I call my classes? And if I look at a design, how do I interpret everything? And you end up trying to create your own naming conventions and looking around to see what other people are doing. And it can be quite messy, particularly as your code grows or your design grows. And I came across the concept of BEM through many places. One of them was through, with Kevin Gary with frames, and if anyone's seen Kevin Gary's lives, he's an absolute evangelist and he's an absolute legend in the way he uses BEM and meticulous in the way he uses it. It just makes things easier to understand. So I started adopting it. Had the same problem as everyone else, where okay, BEM is really easy, really, really simple concept, but when you go to apply it, that's when you get confused. So what do I make a block? What do I make an element? Where do I use my modifiers? How deep do I go? How complex does this need to be? It gets really hard, and people start going, well, do I understand it? And I was there, and I was communicating through forums, going, how do you use it? What do you apply your blocks to, and elements, and just getting an idea of how other people think. And that's part of the issue, because when you look at the BEM standards, like if you go to getbem.org, it's a very simple, clear standard, but it doesn't detail how you apply it. That comes down to how you interpret it, and everyone has their own ideas. Some people go really complicated and have big long names and link all of their things together, and other people keep it very simple.
Right.
And so I think what happens is people think of it, they look at it and they go, oh, this is too hard. And I've had comments from when I've mention BEM in videos, I've got a list here saying it's too hard. The other one is I only use it when I have to. I have my own naming system. Why do I need BEM?
Yeah.
And one that surprises me is people think that they need automatic CSS or advanced SEMA to use BEM, or they have to pay for a plugin to use it. I think Maxime will probably tell everyone you need AT for it, but sorry, Maxime, burst your bubble. But it certainly makes working with it easier, but it's not something you need. So BEM is not it's not owned by anybody. It's not something you pay for. It's not something difficult. It's just a concept. Just a very, very simple concept. So I guess I reached out to you to say, well, are you finding the same thing? You finding that a simple concept is becoming really, really hard because people overthink it or they think it's hard? Yeah. And that's the reason I reached out to you to have that chat.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I like I said, I just got into this Bricks Arena class-based. I kind of I knew what classes and IDs were, but I hadn't been developing with them like on a regular basis. And then found, again, we all find Kevin's videos when we're in this arena, and we find those types of things. And if you're using ACSS as an example, like you said, you don't need it for those, but ACSS, they make it easier. And there was I made a video with Kevin a month or so ago where we're kind of like, he was like helping me kind of walk through it and think through it. And when you start to understand how easy, BEM can kind of be, just block element modifier, then it opens up like a lot of opportunities really just to make your life a whole lot easier and just make your code like a lot more standardized in a lot of ways. Just, I don't know, really just help your sanity, I think, because there's a lot of ins and outs, a lot of different things that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, I mean, I'm super excited to kind of dive into this and everything. And one thing we forgot to say, I think at the top is, guys, if you have any questions as we go through this, in a little bit here, we're going to switch over to Alan's screen. We're going to talk about, he's going to demo some stuff. He's going to show us exactly what we're talking about here in theory. So if you have any questions, throw them in the comments. Happy to answer them. We want this to be more of a conversation too, just like we said, so everybody can benefit. So do you think anything else, Alan, or do you think we want to just dive in, or what are you thinking?
I guess we can just dive in. So, I mean, I've got right up front, I just want to say, look, I'm not an expert. It's just my interpretation of BEM, how I use it, and I'm constantly on the lookout for making things easier and more productive. I've just come to a point that I use it in a certain way. It makes sense to me. Because I always do things the same way, it just makes sense and keeps things more consistent. In fact, I've taken even a step further where BEM is really a class naming convention, but I actually use the same naming convention when I'm naming CSS variables. I use the same naming convention when I'm addressing those blocks and elements in JavaScript. Okay. So it just keeps everything consistent. You're not sitting there thinking, well, what am I going to call this? And what should I name that variable? You just name it the same. I mean, JavaScript, you've got to use camel case or something rather than your dashes, but keep that the same. And then when you look at your design and your code, it's obvious what everything relates to. Just keep things simple rather than trying to reinvent something. And the other thing that kind of drew me back to it is I invented my own naming system for myself as well, just like everyone else tries. And what drew me back to is A, its simplicity, and B, it's broad acceptance. So if I was to use another developer, for example, I don't have to explain to them how my naming convention works. I just say I use BEM. And I know, and I want you to use BEM. And it's broadly understood, broadly used, and it just makes sense for those reasons.
Definitely power in that. If you hire somebody, if you're working with somebody on a team, or you bring somebody in and they also use it, you don't have to like teach them your system. It's like this is universally accepted in a lot of ways. So cool.
And I don't know if I should be saying this here, but I had the same thing with automatic CSS. At first, I'm like, I can write Sass. I can write my own framework. I'm just going to do that. Why do I need it? And then you start realizing, well, hold on. These guys spend hours every single day improving it. They document it. They show people how to use it. If I get someone else and say, hey, I want you to work with me, I use ACSS. They should understand it.
Mhm.
They don't have to
Yeah.
learn my framework or how I work, because it's a common way of working.
Right.
And that's what I'm looking for, is that simplicity, consistency, and the ability to work with other people.
Yep. 100%. Love it. Sweet. You want me to switch over to your screen? We can kind of just
Sure.
dive into some stuff. So
Yeah.
let me flip over here. Sweet.
Okay. So one of the first things I just wanted to mention, clearly I'm using Bricks Builder for those of you who aren't. I'm not sure who is there here. Wouldn't be a Bricks user, but one of the things that confuses people a lot is naming of blocks and elements and modifiers. So in Bricks, if we look at the list on the left-hand side here, Bricks calls those elements. They're not BEM elements, though. They're just Bricks elements. Okay. They also have a element called a block, which is basically a div set to flex and 100% wide. It is not a BEM block.
Yeah.
Okay. So what people get confused with is they think that this block is where I put my BEM block name. And where do I put the element? And I get questions like, can I make a section a block? Can I make a container a block? So there's a confusion in naming. So it's and I get tongue twisted and all this sort of stuff myself when I'm talking to people about it. So the way I kind of interpret it, I've got this Get BEM, which is a website, getbem.com. And if you look at their introduction, it's confusing. Actually, sorry, I thought that was the homepage. Go to the homepage here. Their introduction is BEM is a methodology that helps you to create reusable components and code sharing and front-end development. How confusing is that for someone who doesn't even know what it is or how to use it? Yeah, it's like 100%. That's not a very good explanation. But if you go to the naming, it's actually very, very simple. If you read this, lots of text there, but basically there are two main types: so blocks and elements. So your blocks is like a reusable design or reusable block of code. So that could be dual buttons, or that could be a header set, or anything that is going to have elements inside it as a design, which I'll show you in the actual builder. And then that block might have elements. So I don't know if you can see this here. So if I've got a pen, for example, in a real world example, a pen could be a block. An element of that pen could be the clip to clip it onto your shirt. Another element could be the button. Another element could be the actual the pen inside with the ball on the end of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does to me. I think probably a lot of other Bricks users have, if they've experimented with BEM, they've definitely had the issue of, like, is this, like, what like you were saying earlier, like what can be a block and and what isn't a block, because we have this language discrepancy, right?
We do.
So it's like, the way I've understood it in Bricks terms is like you have section, container, block, and div. And a lot of the times the B of your BEM could ultimately a lot of times be any of those things, depending on like what you are actually trying to, for lack of a better term, like BEM, like, actually classify as the there's too many words. I was going to say like a component of the things that you're doing, but like that, you have to like break it down, because you could have, as I know we'll get into it, foreshadowing a little bit. If you look on the right-hand side of the structure panel, it's like, you don't just start at the section and like, BEM everything out from the whole thing, because a lot of it's kind of modular. If you've ever worked with like a template system, like a frames or, bonsai templates or anything like that, there's normally like smaller chunks, smaller pieces that attribute to the whole, maybe a larger block, right? So it's very interesting to kind of go back and forth and kind of see that. But yeah.
So Matt just made a comment there, and that's absolutely right. And I mean, the other thing, I started referring to these as components because there wasn't a component in Bricks, but now they're talking about bringing out components in Bricks. if we talk about these BEM blocks as being components, now it's going to be even more confusing. So
Yeah.
it's the difficulty people have, and I think just you got to separate the two. You got to separate the two as to, your BEM is basically your design structure, not your builder. I mean, this BEM is not specifically for bricks. You could use it in any content creation, any page builder. It's exactly the same methodology, and they're going to have different names for things. Like I think Elementor call these things here on the left-hand side, I think they call them widgets.
Yeah, at one point, I think, yeah.
So you just got to get, so that's where people get lost in the naming. So I think one of the questions you mentioned, say, for example, the sections, containers, blocks, and divs. Normally, for me, when I'm using bricks, my BEM block will start from one of these. Very rarely, for me, does it start from a section or a container.
Okay.
Normally, it's a block or a div. And the only difference between a block and a div is that a div is a raw div with no predefined settings. A block is a div that's flex at 100%. Okay, so they're both the same HTML element. Bricks have just made it easy for us to very quickly add something that's already flex and already 100% and call it a block.
Yep.
Okay, so those two there to me are the starting point. And the reason for that is, let's say, for example, I'll come back to this, but I've got a very simple two column content layout here. That's inside a container. If I want that to be full width, I just take it outside of the container, and now it's full width. Okay, so this is not constrained to the container. If I started my block at the container, my BEM block at the container, I'm constrained as to where I can use that now. I have to use that in a boxed layout because it's in a container. So if you're thinking about components and reusability, it doesn't make sense to put your BEM components inside containers.
Are you saying, explain that again though for me? So you're saying, you mean like as a child of a container, or you're saying like like starting in the container?
Okay. Sorry, no, starting it from there. So if you on this container, if you started your BEM block naming from there,
right,
that means that structure is always going to be boxed.
Yeah.
Right. If you save that as a template and then add that to a page, that structure is always going to be boxed. You don't have a choice. But if you start from a div or a block for down here, you can stick that inside a container, or you can stick it outside the container, depending on whether you want it to be boxed or not. Certainly. Yeah. So kind of thinking down to reusability. How can I reuse this? Yeah.
Do you ever create a section though that you have BEMified, let's say?
Yes. Yeah. So there might be, for example, a promo section, and that promo section is the same no matter where you stick that on your website.
Yeah.
Right. So it can make sense when you do that. It might have certain colors, spacing, typography. Save as a template. No matter where you put that on your design on your site, it's going to be the same everywhere. Right. It kind of makes sense then. But when you've got something like this 2-column grid layout, that's not going to be the same content, the same spacing, the same everywhere that you use it. Yeah. Right. So it's like a component or a part that you use.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's BEM'd separately, right? Yeah,
Correct.
It's like it's its own. Yeah.
Correct.
Cool.
So leading up here, what we'll do is I won't spend too much time on this. It won't go into the actual styling of these things, just the concept of it, and then we'll get some feedback. Is this confusing? Is this make sense, or is there some better ideas of how to apply this? So basically, if we looked at this top section here, I've got a BEM block. So BEM blocks, I should actually say here, BEM blocks always start with, I always name, where's my...
Oh, we have a good question here too, right off the bat here. So deciding from Giannis here. So deciding where to start your BEM has nothing to do with grouping, has to do with grouping of things, not what kind of element it is, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
So it's thinking of things as a part.
Mm-hmm.
Is this part going to be reusable? So, for example, my dual buttons here. I've created one here called dual buttons. So I've got a BEM block of dual buttons. I've got button 1 and I've got button 2. Now, that dual button could be used anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you make that I've just made it a div as a component. Down here where I've used the dual buttons, I'll come back to all this is getting a bit too deep. It's a dual button BEM block, but it's also an element of our content to call.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the reason we make an element of content to call is because we want it to look different when it's inside there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So our core styling is on the dual buttons. The specific styling to it being a element of content to call is on that class there.
Yep.
So that's where we put a bit of padding on it. We put a border around it and put some rounding on it. So whenever we put that inside this layout, that's how we want it to look.
Yep.
Okay. So we've reused this basic BEM block up here, and we've made that an element of this only because we wanted to restyle it.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. We got another. I like it. We got another comment from Isaac. Says you could just use divs. That could simplify things since bricks blocks is just a div with some extra steps. I think we definitely. I know you've already said that with blocks are just flex 100%, right?
Yeah.
So I mean they're kind of interchangeable depending on what you're doing, I suppose. Yeah. But yeah, good stuff.
For me, I typically, honestly, I would say 90% of the time, I will start my BEM blocks with a div. Mm-hmm. And that way I haven't got anything I have to undo if I want it to. So for example, with this dual button, I start with a div. Mm-hmm. I've made that 100% in here, but if I take that 100% off, it's now aligned there. Mm-hmm. Right? If that was a block, it would be 100%, and I've got to unset that setting. All right. So if I now go to the cell, if I say that content to call cell, and I want to align everything to the center, that's going to align properly because it's not taking up 100%.
I see what you're saying. So you're saying that normally your workflow is normally start with a div.
Yeah.
So you can add the appropriate settings rather than start with a block and remove or adjust the settings.
Correct.
Got it. Okay.
So if we start if we look at that dual button here, here's my dual button. In my settings, I've made it flex and put some column gap on it.
Yep.
And made it a row.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. On the content to call, I've made that a grid. In the cell, in this case here, because I know my cells, I always want, this is a grid, I always want my cells to be, 100% wide of what they're going to take up in that grid. I'll use blocks for that, so I don't have to bother changing these settings. But when I start at the beginning at the block, in this case, I know I'm always going to have that content be 100%, the width. Mm-hmm. So why not just use a block? Because it's already set to a flex 100%. Mm-hmm. Right. But when you're making components, like for example, this heading set up here, where I've got a heading set here, I want to be able to align that heading set inside when I use it inside other components. So if I used a block there, that's going to be 100% of that width, which means I can't align it from its parent. I've got to go into that element and tell it to align. Mm-hmm. Is that getting too complex?
I mean, I'm following.
Okay.
Do you want to? Yeah, we got one more other here. You add a second class just in case you need to change an individual one, which I think I'm understanding that from Ground Pets. I think he was referring to when you were adding like you had like your main kind of default class basically for your styling of your buttons. And then you add another, I believe, yeah. If I'm understanding, Ground Pets, correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, that totally makes sense. So do you want to, do you want to kind of start at the top and then or I mean, anything that we haven't talked about with the demo so far, and then we can continue with
Sure.
other questions and stuff.
Just quickly answering that question, it's about how things relate to each other. Okay, so if this button set here was going to look the same everywhere, regardless of whether I use it, I wouldn't need to make that an element of this here. You can also create modifiers. So if you've got a common look, which I'll look at up here, if you've got a common look that you wanted to use in multiple places, instead of making that an element of this structure, you could just add a modifier to it, the BEM modifier. Okay, and that'll be a common look that you apply in multiple places. So you really would only make that an element of this structure if it's only going to look different on that element. Yeah.
Right.
And I guess the analogy I've used with that, talking to someone else, and I get lost in analogy, so forgive me if I do, but if you look like a wheel on a car, right? A wheel on a car on its own has properties. It has a diameter. It has a tire has a width. It has a certain type of tread. Has a certain design on the rim. Standing alone, a wheel is a wheel, right? When you put it on a car, on a particular model of that car, it might have a different profile on the tire. It might have a different width of tire. So you would make that an element of so the wheel would become a part of that car, which is to have its own properties.
Yeah.
Underlying that, it's still a wheel.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. For sure.
Hopefully that hasn't confused. All right. So what I've done here is, so if I look at my heading set, it's probably the easiest one to explain. So with my heading set, I've basically set the div at the top here as my heading set. Now in BEM, all of your blocks are named where you lowercase and you just use dashes. You can only use dashes to separate your spaces. Okay. So what we typically do is, what we got here?
There's one question here. How do you name BEM classes if you go deeper than 2 child elements? Sometimes I get long class names and it looks awful. I'm assuming you're probably going to cover that within kind of like as we continue.
I would say with that, you basically think of things from the smallest outwards. So if you've got something that's 2 or 3 deep, you probably need to rethink that design, because that thing that's 2 or 3 deep is probably a component on its own.
Right.
Does it really need to have linkage back up through to its parents if it's always going to look the same? Yeah. And if it's only going to be relevant to that particular block, can it be just named relevant to the top level block? Does it have to be named to the block to the one above it and then the one above that? Yeah. So I'll look at that here. For example, in the heading set here, we've got a BEM block which is just heading dash set. And what makes sense, and later on we look at the advanced thema and ACSS tools that help us with BEM. This really makes sense where you name your elements here in bricks exactly the same as you're going to name them in the classes. Okay, but it's human readable. So heading set, it's capitalized with a space. Your name for that block is lowercase heading dash set. Okay, that makes it really easy to refer to and know how they're related to each other. Okay, we then come down to a header, which is another div, and the reason I put that in a div because we want no spacing between the accent and the heading, but we want spacing between that header and the accent and the lead underneath it. Yeah.
And an important point here I think we need to make is there's on this install, what we're doing, this is just vanilla bricks. There's no ACSS, and there's no AT. So
correct.
You've obviously before the stream, like all this is on here, and you've kind of made the class and everything like that, like you're demoing. But like on the right-hand side of the structure panel, all that is human readable there, like you were saying, and then you have your classes set over on the left-hand side in the top of the settings there. But
correct.
all of this is vanilla brick. So again, to talk about our point of, do you need something for BEM? You do not. Like we're literally showing.
Correct. So I purposely did that so we can start from this point. We are really, really lucky that we're at Bricks 1.9.8 because all of this layout, I just created a little mini framework using their new variables manager here, which I'm going to do another separate video on. And also, I think Maxime might still be there because he doesn't sleep. AT has got a brilliant connection to this. It synchronizes the AT variable management with this as well. So that's going to be a separate thing we'll do. It makes it easier, to manage your variables and create, clamps and all that sort of stuff. So this demo is just basically using a very mini framework based on variables in Bricks 1.9.8. Okay, so there is no other add-on for this at the moment.
Nice.
All right, so basically we've got a header. I often use, when I'm creating things like for example, if you're creating classes, creating cards and things like that, I'll use a methodology here where I'm going to just add a couple here, say a couple of divs. I'll use header, body, footer, because that's a very common layout. And that way you can sort of, push your footer to the bottom, align your body and push your header to the top, all that sort of stuff. So that's a common name that I use when I'm grouping stuff that's going to go in the heading, body, or footer. That's just something I've decided to do. Not a requirement, but so I've created a div called header, which is a element of my heading set. So the two underscores make it an element. Okay. So
that's the header. Well, let me just stop there because I definitely need to understand this. Like heading set is your B, right? Your block.
Correct.
Header double underscore header is your element. And then we get to modifiers. We talk about modifiers, but that people need to understand if you're very new to BEM, which I'm not sure if everybody's very new to BEM, but if you have any questions about that's the ultimate structure that you're seeing. So just want to clarify that for the people. Perfect.
Correct. And this might answer that last question too. So inside the header, we have a heading. Okay, so that's our main heading. And then we've got an accent, which is just a basic text. So again, these are elements. So that's the heading element, and that's the accent element. I think this is part of the confusion that people have. So I've got my heading set. At the top is my B.
Yep.
I've got the header as an E. And then I've got the heading that's inside that header, but I don't go heading set, header, heading in my naming. It's just the heading of my block. Yeah. So what happens often is that, you'll get deeper and deeper in here and people think, okay, if I had another block in here and I call that another row and I call that row 1, and then inside there I add another basic text and call that my meta, they think they've got to add heading set, header, row 1, meta in your naming. Right. But in this heading set, you've only got one meta, right? So there's no point in naming it going up, up, up.
Right.
So you could just call that, actually, I'll just copy the name from up here. And again, this is my interpretation. If you disagree, I'd love to hear why. So I would just call that underscore meta. Right.
But I think the other idea though here that you mentioned earlier is that if you were using this heading set as a block, right? Like the B in BEM, and you were starting from there, by the time you get to row 1, there is a high likelihood that that's possibly another block, right? Like if it was going to be like a row with like certain things within that, even though that block, that new piece, that new part of this is within something else, there's a high likelihood that you might want to take that out and use it somewhere else as like a modular component or a modular piece. Or again, the language is terrible, but so there's something to be said for that as well. Maybe not, but I think makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. So Giannis just asked the question about what happens if you decide to use a second meta. That comes down to, why would you have a second meta? If you're using a second meta, wouldn't that be different somehow? So it might be author meta. It might be post meta.
Right.
Yeah. So you got to think of it in your naming. So if this is my author meta, I would change that name there to be author meta.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little counterintuitive, I think, when you're learning it too, because you have to think of it. You have to, like, we all think of websites as like big sections and all that sort of stuff. But you have to like retrain your brain almost to think in like the smallest common denominator, so to speak. And then those smallest little modular pieces create the bigger sections.
Correct.
So it's like you have to lay it all out, and then you almost have to always go from the inside out when you're naming all of the classes and things like that.
So an example I'll use, I'll just see if I've got my login here for Netflix. Example I used was on Netflix. If we looked at a video grid here. So if I was to look at this video, this section here with these videos, and I know you guys get lots more in America than what we get here.
I forgot to mention that it is literally 6 a.m. in Australia. So give Alan some love for being up at this time.
So if we looked at this here, we're going to say that's a BEM block is this section here. We've got a header, we've got a row with some cards in it. We wouldn't start as being, this is a video, a video grid. And then from the video grid, this becomes our heading. This becomes our row. This becomes our video grid card. You actually would go, just, whoops. I don't know if you can hear the sound coming through there, but so this card would not be an element of that section block, because that card will be used in multiple places and it will always look the same. Right? So that card would start its own BEM block from that card. You go inside, well, you've got this, the categories down here. That category display might be used in multiple places and it might look the same wherever you use it. So from a BEM block perspective, you'd start your category as a BEM block here, add your elements inside there, and then whenever you want to use that somewhere, you just use that BEM block. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yep.
It does. Okay, good. Hopefully.
Yeah.
So
love it.
In the sense here, for example, I've just saved some templates. If I just grab a new, actually, I'll come back to, I'm jumping ahead here. So let's go to take that out of there. So our BEM structure here is we've got a heading set, we've got a header, and we've got some other elements underneath that, which are all indicated by this underscore. I think I've created a modifier. Let me just check on here.
I'll answer this question here real quick. Giannis said, you renamed meta to author meta. What happens to the class naming if I change the name of the element? That's a good question. If you change something on the right-hand side, correct me if I'm wrong, Alan, nothing happens to the classes. The reason that you're doing that is the right side of your screen is to manage you, like knowing what is what. And like, obviously you want it to be consistent, but the classes have no effect on that in default vanilla bricks. I know that if you have like ACSS, you can rename the structure panel on the right-hand side, and then you can BEM that, and you can like sync the labels and do all that sort of stuff. But yeah, by default, you have to manage them kind of separately. Like they could be different. They don't have to be exactly the same. You'd want them to be the same probably, but they don't have to be.
Yeah.
It's a good question though.
Yeah, absolutely correct. So there is no linkage between the two. This is all in bricks. This is a manual mapping of your class names to your names that you've added on the elements in the structure panel.
Yep.
Okay. There are some tools that help you with that, like you said, with ACSS and with Advanced Seamer. So the last part of this I'm going to talk about is the modifier. So if I create a heading set, and I'm going to call it modifier is always 2 dashes, and I put the word center, and I'll spell it in the American way. So if I put 2 dashes center, right, and on that modifier, I decide I want to center everything, and in my typography, center the text as well. Now this heading set now is all centered because I have a center modifier on it. Okay, all of the core styling is done from the heading set class itself and the elements below it. But this modifier tells the the block that I want to center everything.
Right.
So that could be for size, alignment, anything you want it to be. You can make up a modifier to change the behavior of that block or that element.
Yeah.
So,
and I think we have to. I don't know if you're going to say this, but I have to jump in here. The reason, from my estimation, right, you had your default styling on heading set that made it exactly how you wanted it. But this particular heading set, you want to make it centered. So you may think that you should style it at the ID level. But if you style it at the ID level, then it's literally just that one instance of it. So instead of doing that, you've created a modifier class so you could potentially center other ones the exact same way. So it's like a modified block, basically, is what it is.
Yep. So I'm going to create another one. I'll show you exactly that. If I create another one, quit hitting. Hitting set dash end. We use the flex naming, so dash end. And on that, we align our text to the right and our content to the end. We've got a modifier now changing the behavior there. So if I take that off, and I'm going to copy my heading set, come down in the sections here. I'm just going to add a new section down the bottom here. Inside that container there, I'm going to paste my basic heading set. I'm going to duplicate that a couple of times.
Yep.
Put a bit of spacing there. Okay, so we got 3 of the same BEM elements, BEM blocks. On the second one, if I add heading set, center, I've got a centered version of that design. On the third one, if I add a heading set end, I've got a right justified version of that same block. So I haven't had to restyle anything. I haven't gone into the settings and on every single element and told it to realign it. I've simply added a modifier. Yep.
And you can use those everywhere. And then if you want it, like let's say you had 100 heading sets on your website and 30 of them you wanted to set to the end for some reason, you could use that class on all of those 30. And then because you didn't do it at the ID level, you could potentially come back into this modifier class and change some other CSS property, and it would persist through all of them. That's, again, the huge benefit of classes.
So, for example, there's a good example there on the centered one. If we go into that and say, look, on the centered one, we actually want that to have a border on the bottom. I don't know why you would, but let's say we want a border on the bottom of that one of 1 pixel, solid brand color. Okay. Now on our centered heading, we've got a 1 pixel solid border on the bottom. Right.
Yep.
If we take the modifier off, we don't have that border on the bottom anymore. So as you said, because it's on a class, you might use this in 100 places throughout your website. You decide on all the centered ones, I want to stick a border on the bottom of it, or I want to stick an after pseudo or something like that on it. You just modify the class.
Yep. We've got a couple things here I'd love to touch on. We had some good comments back and forth in the chat. So Giannis had another one from the last question. So you need AT or ACSS to rename classes accordingly if you decide to make changes. Looking through the comments here. So the answer is no manually. Like you certainly can change the structure panel and then go into the class manager or just like in the left-hand side there and change the classes and things like that. But I do have a question, because I think this is really where the question is. When you're using ACS and you click that sync labels button, does that automatically keep everything updated, or do you still have to manage it manually if you change a structure label? That would be, I think that's part of the question.
It automatically changes it for you. So there's actually a mode on it to rename.
Yeah.
So ACSS works in 2 ways. So for example, if you let's start a new section here. So if I create a new block, div, let's call this our, did that add? No, it didn't. We'll just call this our demo block. And let's just stick one element on it. We'll call that a heading. Okay, so we've got a demo block and a heading. Actually, what I'll do is I'll just enable ACSS and AT so I can show you. So I think we've got to that point.
Gotcha.
So as you can see in the plugins at the moment, all I've got enabled is instant images and WP reset. So this is pure bricks that we've been using so far.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say too is certainly sometimes you're going to have to rename classes and you want to rename structure panel things and stuff like that. And if you're able to automate that, that's obviously a plus. But correct me if I'm wrong, as somebody who's more of a seasoned at this, like when you have gone through and you've gotten your reps through this, don't a lot of times like you kind of know what you're going to name things like as you're going. So you're not really doing a hell of a lot of renaming if you're doing from scratch. Or is that, am I wrong in saying that?
Yes. Yeah. No, that's correct. Most times if I rename, it's because I look at something and think, oh, that was a stupid name, or if I want a kind of a duplicate of it,
right?
You might create in fact, with AT, you can actually copy the whole structure with a different name. Yeah. So, and Maxime's arguing with us. He does that. He's arguing that most of the time you should use a utility class instead of a modifier. Yeah, it's definitely another argument, and particularly if it's a common thing like centering or aligning, or sizing and things like that. But I don't know. It's just for me mentally, if it is something's related to an element, it makes more sense for me to have that styling at that element. Yeah, I'd have to have a bit more of a think about that, because I very rarely use utility classes except for the common things like, for example, line clamping. I'll have a line clamp utility class because when you line clamp, you're clamping lines, you're deciding how many lines to show. It doesn't really matter where you use it, it's going to perform exactly the same function. Yeah. So
I think
you are right, Maxime, in that it is an option. But man, we're talking about BEM here. We're talking about the BEM way of doing it. So
yeah, I think there's probably pieces of that. There's probably pieces of that where what's the there's got to be like a reason for the modifier thing. Like obviously if you just wanted to center things and you only had like one like instruction or CSS property assigned, right? Then you could say like, utility center or something, and you could use that for all sorts of different stuff. Like it doesn't have to just be a heading. It could be a lot of different things depending on the instructions, right? But if you were trying to modify something specifically with a bunch of different instructions and you were going to have that repeated, then I feel like that's definitely a use case of a modifier, right? If I'm understanding it correctly. I'm not, my fault. Ben was wrong.
Maxime's Mr. Internet. Anyway, so look, I guess it comes down to just how you mentally work, what makes sense to you. I don't think there's a right and a wrong with that. I do agree that if it's a very simple thing, like a font size or a alignment or something like that, then sometimes just using a modifier class makes sense. For me, I just like to work in one way, and just make it simple for my brain to work. When I'm doing stuff, I always do it the same way, and that's just how I work. Doesn't mean I'm right and Maxime's wrong. It's probably pretty unlikely, but it's just we work differently, and I think you're going to find that through all web dev, where people have habits they formed, ways that you work. and some are better than others, but there's not necessarily a right and a wrong.
For sure. Do you
Yeah.
think there's a comment here from Kalor? Could we demonstrate the difference between using utility classes and modifiers with a very basic example? Yeah, I mean,
Sure.
I can't think of one, but if you have one, I think that would be a great concept. I mean,
Well, there's the
even just something.
example. Did I just undo that? Well, let me just I just delete stuff.
Yep.
Where did I get to?
Yeah. Yeah, Maddie says at some point it just boils down to personal philosophy and preference for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, here I've got on this second one, I've got everything aligning to the right, to the center, right? And I'm using a BEM modifier for that. Okay, let's take that off and use a utility class, which would be, let's say, center content. What would you call this? Inline. So we're just going to create a utility called inline center, which could be applied to any element, any element on here. We can do exactly the same thing where we just align that to the center, and then in our topography, align that. We're going to do exactly the same thing. Actually, I applied it to the wrong. Oh, it's not. That is work. So on this element here in the middle here, I've used a utility class instead of a BEM modifier. Yeah. That is a very simple structure. But what happens if, like I said, for that I wanted to add the border at the bottom as well? I need now to add another utility class to add a border at the bottom with the primary color.
Yeah.
If I add it as just the modifier, there, I can add all the changes I want there. I could even go a bit deeper. I'm not going to go into it here, into the CSS. And we could have for example, this modifier. I think maybe I'll pick the wrong, maybe where it's getting confused. I'll probably pick the wrong example in centering stuff. What if we wanted to have this as a featured? We're going to have let's say we rename that.
Yeah, I think it needs to be more specific to the block, right? Would kind of be the idea. Like it's like you're not gonna feature other random blocks of types of content, right? I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah. So let's say our modifier is featured in there, and in featured we're going to center everything, and we're going to change the background color to our primary dark, and we're going to change the topography color to our, that might be our featured set. Yeah. Right. So it would make sense to have a BEM modifier for that. Probably makes less sense if you're just centering or aligning or changing a size. Yeah. There you could use either a utility class or a modifier. Doesn't make any difference.
Yeah, absolutely. We got a question from Ruben, #Q. Love that. Would BEM out everything or just cards, things that might modification in the future?
Sorry, would BEM... okay. So this is something I find interesting, is that when you're working in bricks, you have to name your class something. All right. So why not use the same methodology regardless of whether you're going to think of this as being a standalone component or not? So even in here, even though I say I might not start my sections at as a block, I might call this my headings section. And if I'm going to style that in some way, I would still call that my heading section, even though that doesn't even have any elements underneath it that I'm going to specify. I'm using the same naming. Yeah. But if I had in my heading section here, I had a header. Up there, I might then make that an element of my heading section. So it now becomes an element of that if I choose to, right? And you only really need to do that if you're going to style it differently somehow. Right? If I wanted my heading section, for that to be a different color or a different font size, make it an element. Right? And if I use this heading section on multiple pages and I decide I want to change the way that heading behaves, I just need to edit that class. Yeah. So it makes sense for me. It makes sense to use the BEM naming regardless of whether you're going to use it or not straight away, because down the track you might.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got you, Matt. Ruben corrected his grammar here. Would you BEM everything? Would you BEM everything out, or just cards, for example, things you need to mark? Okay. I think I understand this, because I also have this problem because I watch too much Kevin Geary content. So like, do you Alan put every single thing in the right hand structure panel? Does every single one of those have a class on it at all times?
Yes, generally. There are some times where you are only going to do one thing in one place and that's it.
Right.
In that particular instance, there's no value in having classes. You can style it ID, just use the UI to style. It makes no difference whatsoever.
Yeah. So
the beauty of the Bricks being a class-based system is that it makes your designs reusable. So I could create, in this example here, I could create this content block here of the content grid with two columns, and I put that everywhere on the site. And then down the track, I go, look, you know what? I want the right-hand side to be smaller. So I go into my content col and I go, look, I don't want that to be a grid 2. I want that to be, I'll use simple figures here. I want to be 2FR, 1FR, right? Everywhere I've used that on my site is now got that new styling, because I've had the forethought to make sure that these are named with classes that I can style. If I did that at the ID level and then change this one, none of the others would change on that page or anywhere else on the site.
Yep.
So doing this gives you flexibility.
Yep. Exactly.
Example I showed you actually, Mark, when we first spoke was, when you have a common design where you'll have a page hero and you might have some color, a large font, maybe some background effect on it. So you create your page hero, you save it as a template, insert that onto a new page, but you want to change the background image. Right? I would do that at the ID level, because that's the only place you're going to have that background image.
Yep.
Right. But the rest of it, if I decide, look, instead of having a red overlay, I want a green one, I go to my overlay element, I change that to green, and that changes everywhere across the site.
Yep.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So it gives you that flexibility of reuse. And that's what this is all about. It's just reusing components and styles.
Yeah. Ruben, I hope that answered that for you, buddy. I know you're cooking up something in the kitchen that's going to put classes out of business, though. So we're excited to see what that is.
And Ruben likes throwing these little spanners in there too.
Yeah. Leave breakdance alone, everyone. We got a question here from Bob. It's more of like a really insightful thing here. So it's like, he says, you guys are all experienced and seem to have differing opinions. How is a beginner like me supposed to cope? Haha. I have some thoughts on that. Alan, what do you think, though? What do you think as far as that?
I think keep it simple. And, look at BEM, for example. If you're looking at BEM, which we're talking about today, it is basically defining groups of elements by setting one as the top level we call a block. The other parts of it are elements, and it is as simple as that. Modifiers are only used in Maxime's case if you've got lots of complicated things you want to change, but modifiers are only used if you want variations of those. But just keep it simple. Don't and I did this as well. Like the question, I'm not sure who, I think Ruben raised it before, was about when you got multi-levels. Actually, I don't think it was Ruben. Someone else raised it before. When you got multi-levels of elements. So like we went, 6 deep in our containers here. How do you name all that? And I struggle with the same thing where I was trying to relate everything to its parent, right? Until I realized that they're all just elements of the top level block. They just happen to be contained in wrappers for styling, but they're still an element of that block. Yeah. In this case, my lead is an element of my heading set. My accent and my headings are elements of my heading set. Doesn't matter how many deep I go with my wrappers and containers, that's still a heading for the heading set. That's still an accent for the heading set. Yeah.
Yep.
Where I think some people get lost too is like, for example, here, if I go, I'm going to put a basic text and a basic text. What do I call these now? I can call that my text. Now I've got two different elements called text. How do I name those? You name those based on what are they there for?
Right. Contextually.
Yeah. So this is a text. So this could be the author name.
Yep.
Then this could be the author's phone number, whatever it is. You name them on what their purpose is, not what the element is that you added to the editor.
Yep.
Now on this heading set, I've only got one author name, so that there would be heading set __ author name.
Yeah.
Not heading set __ header __ author name, which is invalid in BEM.
Right.
Yeah. So keep it simple. Don't worry about how deep these go. It's an element of the block, not an element of its parent.
That's actually a really good point. I want to get philosophical for Bob here in a second, but that's a really good point. Is in BEM, you have to have a block. Like if you're going to name a BEM class, like a class using BEM, you have to have words, right? Like, the B part, and then you have to have __ element, and then you have to have -- modifier, right?
Yes.
So in no way, shape, or form, if you're doing BEM correctly, do you have something that's like really long there, right? Like you don't have like multiple sets of underscores, right?
No.
Or multiple sets of hyphens to get to the like modifiers. It's always right. That's
Correct.
a really important point. Yeah.
So it's actually invalid in BEM to have chained underscores, chained elements.
Right.
Because an element can't be an element of an element.
Yep. So
it's an element of the block.
It's always going to have that. Right. It's always going to have that then. It's always going to have those three. It might not have all three parts, but it can only have those three parts.
Correct.
Right.
Correct,
like the class name. Okay. Real quick, Bob, because I love this philosophical stuff here, like the actual minutia. Obviously, Alan is a wizard, and we're talking about a lot of technical stuff here. But if I could give you any sort of advice, just because I am relatively newer to this as well, I would say that try to find like one or two people that you can kind of go to and lean on and just like watch a lot of those videos and kind of get a basic understanding of it. And I would be cognizant. I don't know what your stack is, and this goes for anybody, not just Bob here, but I don't know what your stack is currently, but I would say that sometimes the tools are very good, but sometimes depending on your goals, if you actually like want to be like a closer to the developer, closer to the code, you have to kind of understand the stuff without the tools, because the tools are designed by people that know the code already and know how everything works. And this whole idea of I could talk about this for days, but this whole idea of abstraction and like encapsulation of the actual information is really cool because it makes everything faster and more efficient. But at the same time, if you don't understand what's working on underneath of it and how it's actually working, I've literally struggled with this because I would like go into ACSS, I would hit the auto BEM thing and I would do it wrong because I don't know what the hell I'm doing, right? So then I have conversations with guys like Kevin, guys like Alan, and I understand it a lot more. And then I can utilize the tool, how the tool's meant to be used. So that would just be my overall thing. Like things like ACSS, AT, fantastic, but make sure that if you really want to be in this like bricks type of world and closer to the development, closer to the code, I think that's like a really important point, that you have to understand how the things like work. And as far as like how to make that happen, it's just reps. I mean, it's just trying simple stuff and getting more complex. And don't be afraid. Like, don't be afraid to make mistakes because you're just going to keep getting better. So that would be my thought.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
Oh yeah,
I
what
think
is cube?
Isaac's just
Interesting.
cube.
Mm,
I've seen a few different. Is that a naming convention, Isaac?
mm. Actually, what do you think? I'm thinking of one could. Let
Yeah,
me look at some of these comments here. I was on a rant, missed a lot of these comments.
that's okay.
Um,
There's one there from Maddie. I think it's gone down a bit below there. So
mm,
he answered his own question, but yes, modifiers can be on blocks and they can be on elements, because
mm,
you might have, for example, in here, you might have a modifier that modifies the entire block, or even modifies some of the elements within the block. So, for example, if we had this as a featured heading, we might make the font size of the heading bigger,
mhm.
right? But on the heading itself as an element, you might have heading, primary, heading, secondary, to change the color of it. So you can definitely have modifiers on elements as well as on blocks,
Right.
if that suits your design.
Yep. 100%.
Yeah, I think we've run out of time. We've gone over, I think, to do the advanced thema and automatic CSS, but suffices to say that both of them have tools where, how you've seen me go through here. Actually, I didn't create all these, but if I create all of these elements here with these names, I have to manually go over to the classes here and create those classes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If I rename any of these, I have to manually come over here and rename those. Whereas ACSS gives you a little BEM. If you've got children, gives you a little BEM button here. You click on that, you get a UI, you click create, and it creates all the classes for you.
Right.
So if you've got a structure that's got quite a few elements, it's a time saver. And you also mentioned, Mark, that has another mode when you bring it up, where even if you don't name these, you can actually create your BEM name, so your BEM block and element names, and tell it to synchronize back to here, and it'll automatically update the names on the structure panel for you. So there's two modes of operation for that. Yeah. Automatic CSS, advanced thema, at risk of being hammered here, I prefer. I think it's got a lot more features. I'm used to it, I guess. But it also allows you to create, automatically create your BEM names just by right click and create classes.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things I really like about Advanced Themas version is that some people are like, and I know Maxime likes to do this, where when you're creating your starting blocks and elements, you style it all at the ID level. Mm-hmm. You haven't got a class yet. You haven't decided what elements you need and what they're going to be called.
This is a really good point. Yeah.
You style it all at the ID level, and then with Advanced Themas BEM Creator, you just tell it to copy all of the stuff from the ID to the classes and then erase them from the IDs.
Yeah. And in fairness, I believe, don't quote me on this, I think that's coming in ACSS 3.0 as well. Okay. But I will say, like, regardless of what you use or how you use it, that line of thinking is really, like, if you understand what BEM is and you get to understand that, then that workflow is much more familiar to somebody like me that came from Elementor, where everything was literally done at the ID level. It's like I dropped in an element, I started styling it right away. I didn't have to think about classes or whatever. So if you do that, and then you can click a button where it's like, okay, I styled this the way I want it. Now I want to move those styles into a class rather than the ID. That's definitely a different way of doing it that ultimately arrives at a similar place.
So the other thing, and I'm not an expert on the ACSS BEM Creator, because I already had AT and it's so featured, I just tend to use it because I'm used to it. Yeah. The other thing that I really liked in the AT version is, say, for example, in this structure here, where we've got a BEM block at the top here, which is my content to call, but inside of that, I've got a BEM block, which is my heading set. All right. If you ran the class creator from the top here and you've got this heading set in there, it will create classes as elements for all of these as elements of content to call. So it'll automatically find all these and it'll create elements for all these, but you don't want that because this is a standalone This is a standalone component that just happens to be inside there.
Right.
So with advanced thema, you basically right click on it, say, this is a root component. I don't want you to create classes for me when you run the class converter above me. So you can put your classes your BEM blocks inside there, tell them they're root components, run your class converter, and it doesn't create all these erroneous extra classes that you don't need. Okay, so that's a really cool feature, because before what you had to do is you had to drag that out of the structure, run your BEM converter, and then drag it back in again. Yeah. So little features like that just make the naming, the renaming, and again in AT, there's the class manager in AT way better than the one that's been released for Bricks core. Allows duplicating, renaming, so many extra features that you can use to manage what you've done. I absolutely recommend it. If you haven't got it, absolutely recommend getting it. But highlighting the point that you made before, Mark, you absolutely don't need it. It is purely for productivity.
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So if you want to work faster and easier, then you probably do need it. If you're happy doing it all manually, Bricks is highly capable.
Yeah, 100%. Do you want? I think there's a couple questions here. You want to rapid fire them? Okay. Let's see. From Giannis here, one thing that makes it very difficult for me to use classes is this: one class should include only one change in a property or more. I think there's a follow-up here. If it's one-to-one relation, I have to use dozens of classes. If I implement many properties changes in one class, I have a hard time naming them. If I'm understanding that correctly, I mean, you don't have to just have one change, right? Alan, how would you interpret this question?
So no, one class is this is the Bricks class system that a lot of people don't seem to grasp, is that this is a CSS class name. Everything you do in here gets CSS rules on that class. So whatever you do, you change your layout, your colors, your topography, that's all put on that class there. You can also add to that by putting custom CSS, which will also get added to that class.
Yep.
So it's a collection of rules. It's a way of writing CSS using a UI effectively. CSS variables, on the other hand, are a single property. I think that's where people get confused.
Yeah. Kevin popped in and said, "What did I miss?"
Kevin,
you're gonna have to rewatch, buddy. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, I'm glad he just popped in, because I'd hate to see this as a critique on WDD Live and telling me all the things I'm doing right and wrong. Probably most of them wrong, but
that is funny. That is so funny. We got another one here. And the man is in the building for this one. But do you, okay, so from Clore here, but do you want to name them like ACSS does? If you have that previous example when you created heading set __ author meta BEM class modifier, would the ACSS name that heading set __ row 1 __ author meta? Well, a couple things there. One, if what we're saying is correct, we can't have like two sets of underscores there, because that kind of signifies, right, that there's like two elements, and that's not sort of the way that BEM operates. So Kevin said rewatch. What do you mean? You're gonna have to rewatch it, dude, on the replay. But yeah, I think for Colors here, I don't think that's how it works, right? I mean, it's literally like heading set would be your block. Author meta would be your element if you needed it to be your element. But again, we talked about this a little bit. Sometimes that's another block in there, depending on what's in there. It's very hard to talk about this stuff without seeing like a full structure panel of what you want to do, right? Because you don't know how it's actually going to end up looking from a BEM perspective and what you might want to reuse. Yep. So
I think the question here, I think now the pressure's on because Kevin's there, and so I think with all the BEM creators, whether it's the ACSS one or the AT one, it basically bases the naming on the block name and then whatever name you've added to the element. So in the case you're looking at there, for example, this accent, if I ran my BEM creator from this heading set block, that would be heading set __ accent, not heading set __ header __ accent.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically the block and then whatever you've named the element, not what its parents are in the structure panel.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It's making sense to me. Yeah. I mean, I think the hardest thing to understand, that I think I've started to really understand now is, again, just the idea of literally like compartmentalizing each piece of your whole structure, of your whole design. And if you need to have like the smallest, again, it goes back to that smallest common denominator type thing. Like if you have just like one line of like, like an author meta type thing that has a couple different like elements in it, that's its own block, and you could reuse that elsewhere. But that block might end up being in, potentially kind of utilized sort of as children of another piece in the structure panel. Just it's going to be in a section, like it might be in a, another container or something like that. And I don't know, I'm probably not explaining that very well, but
so I think the terminology, I've forgotten the guy's name, the author of Bricks Maven. I asked some questions around my thinking around BEM, because it's a continuous learning. You get it right, then you get it wrong, and then you get it right, and then you see someone else's way of doing it, you think that's better, and eventually you arrive at what works for you. There you go. Idaware, yes, very, very smart chap, very, very smart chap. So what he was saying is that and I hadn't heard this before, the terminology for it is atomic design. And with atomic design, you look for the smallest components, right? And if they're reusable, that becomes its own BEM block, its own component on its own. If it's always going to look the same, no matter where you use it, it's just a piece that you put inside your design.
Yeah. Well, even if it's, correct me if I'm wrong here, I know we got a lot of experts here. Even if it's not going to look exactly the same, but if you could envision, like, it's not really going to change, like kind of structure wise, right? Like, I mean, because you could always like maybe perhaps utilize a utility class on it, depending on what it is, or put a modifier on it. But but if that structure of that smallest atomic block, basically, or whatever, is not going to change, then that's cause to BEMify it and put it and be able to use it as a reusable piece.
Yeah. Absolutely. And just summarizing there, Maxime, he's throwing spanners in there again. Thanks, Maxime. So I think it's just a matter of trying to think simply. When you look at all the structure and all these elements, and you go, oh my God, how am I going to name all that, and how does it relate to each other? As when you first start with it, it's like overwhelming, and you're starting 100%. To think, we've got elements that are 3-4 deep in the structure, and how do I name that? And I think the epiphany for me on that was what I just said before, is it doesn't matter how deep the structure is, name these elements well, and they are just a element from your root block. Yeah. So you don't have to worry about trying to name it to match that structure. It's just an element off that block. Yeah.
Yep.
That was the epiphany for me, to simplify naming. And that's exactly when you run, as I said, when you run your BEM converter from ACSS or AT, that's exactly what it does. It doesn't look at the structure above it. It just goes, what's my block name? What's the name of the element? That's what I'm going to call it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Love it.
So I think probably we've gone a little bit over time here. Sorry, mate.
No, it's
I
all
was
good.
going to show the actual using of the ACSS and AT, but I think we've run out of time for that.
Yeah, we could definitely do another one. I mean, people are always going to need brush ups on BEM and continuing to utilize it. And like we said, I think there's something to be said with understanding like this kind of as being like a 101 type of thing, like understanding how the methodology works and everything like that. And then 202 is like, once you start to feel a little comfortable with that, then you can understand how the tools are implementing the methodology, which I think is huge.
Kevin, 100% agree that I think we're trying to sort of, I guess, address those who are just starting with BEM. So we don't want to go too deep in our structures, but absolutely agree. Sometimes it makes sense to absolutely do that. So if it's for example, if I stuck an icon inside this header, I might actually call that icon header icon.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give you a very quick example of that. If I go icon, I might call that insert. I might actually call that a header icon. Oh, they didn't type.
I hate it when it does that. You got to click twice over there.
It's doing some strange things. Yeah, it's not.
Oh, it's bugging out.
Yeah. So I might actually call that header icon. So that would become my heading set as the block. My element would be heading set __ header dash icon. And that could make sense if you've got icons and things like that, because you can't just call, if you've got multiple icons, you can't call them all icon.
Right.
Okay. And that name relates it to the parent that it's in. So I think that's is that what you're meaning, Kevin? I think that's what you're meaning.
Yeah. I would say one other thing too is for anybody that's like newer to it. Oh, this is a good comment from Chloe. You don't want to delete it, just start typing. Yeah, it's a real pain. But yeah, Kevin said that. Yeah. The only other tip that I would give that's kind of helped me over my journey so far, and again, maybe you guys are even further along than me, but anybody that's watching that is still trying to understand a lot of this stuff is also like looking at things like the naming structure again within like frames, because then you can see like how a whole section, like the classes are laid out for a whole section. And again, at first it's going to be super overwhelming and you might not know what's going on. But like if you can look at other websites and other things that have done properly, it's always like a really good way to, kind of understand BEM and those types of concepts too. But definitely starting simple, try to stay as, as a close to atomic design, like that type of, way as possible. I don't know. I feel like it's working for me. And again, like I appreciate all you guys sharing your knowledge of doing this stuff, because Alan, this has been great, my man.
And shout out to Kevin too, because Kevin, I hope this isn't an offensive word, but your OCD approach to naming and accessibility and getting things right really makes us think about how we're doing things and what we can improve on as well. So, but it's always a journey. It's always, you start with, I mean, even Kevin would probably admit this, if you look at frames, the frames that were built at the beginning and you look at them now, they're quite different in their naming and structure. And it's a learning curve for everyone. So there's no experts. There's no experts in this. There's just, all of us having a go at getting better at it, so anyway, but I'll leave it at that. So
awesome. Yeah, one last comment here from Maddie. Yeah, if you're struggling with naming, it's an eternal struggle. That's 100%. Naming shit is not easy, as evident with a lot of things in the WordPress community. So it's tough.
BEM makes it easier.
BEM does make it easier. Yeah, 100%. So switch back here. We got these. Alan, brother, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for reaching out. We should do another one of these, talking about the tools and everything like that too. Would love to do that. I'm going to kick it over to you though. I think probably a good amount of the people watching know who you are and what you got going on, but definitely shout out your channel, what you got going on, anywhere you want to send anybody.
Oh, okay. So I just love learning, love sharing. I moved to Bricks probably 18 months ago, and it was like a freedom from being constrained in the way you're doing things. And it's been a continuous learning curve ever since. But as you know, I do have a YouTube channel, the WP Easy. I'm not a I don't monetize in a sense. I'm not looking to sell training or sell anything. So it's just me hitting the record button, sharing an idea, and if you gain something from it, great. If you don't, that's fine too. So that's pretty much what I'm all about.
I love it, brother. I just dropped the channel, the link to Alan's channel, WP Easy, in the chat. It's also in the description, everything like that. If you're not already subscribed, go subscribe to Alan. Awesome content. Love it, man. Like I said, we should do this again. I greatly appreciate having you on, man. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Yep. All right, guys. We'll talk to you later. Thank you so much.